The family decided you don't need to be here for this, Emma. My brother Trevor blocked the doorway to Grandma Rose's estate, his 6'2" frame filling the entrance like a wall I'd spent 32 years trying to get around. Behind him, through the grand foyer I'd walked through 100 times as a child, I could see my sister Madison and my mother Patricia disappearing into the library where the will reading was about to begin. Trevor's expression held that particular blend of condescension and discomfort that I'd learned to recognize before I could tie my own shoes. The look that said he knew he was being cruel, but had convinced himself it was somehow necessary. "You were never really close to Grandma anyway," he continued, his voice dropping to that fake sympathetic tone that made my stomach clench. "Mom thought it would be easier for everyone if you just waited somewhere else. You understand?" It wasn't a question. I stood there on the limestone steps of the estate, the May sun beating down on my shoulders, wearing the same black dress I'd worn to Grandma's funeral 3 weeks earlier, because it was the only one I owned that seemed appropriate, and I felt that familiar sensation of being erased wash over me like cold water. This was supposed to be different. When Mr. Harrison's office had called to inform me of the will reading, I'd thought maybe, finally, I was being included in something, that perhaps in death, Grandma Rose had made sure I had a place at the table I'd never been offered in life. Instead, here was Trevor, doing what Trevor had always done, what the whole family had always done, making the decision that I didn't quite belong, that my presence was optional, that whatever was happening inside those walls was family business, and I was something slightly other than family. "Where should I wait?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded, hating that I was asking at all instead of pushing past him or leaving entirely or doing any of the things a person with self-respect might do. Trevor's relief was visible, grateful I wasn't going to make a scene. "There's a sitting room off the east hallway. Someone will come get you when we're done." When they were done. Not we. I followed the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who'd worked for Grandma for 20 years and couldn't quite meet my eyes as she led me through the side entrance. Down the corridor past the library where I could hear voices gathering, into a small room I'd never been in before, a room that felt like it existed specifically for people who didn't quite rate the main event. She closed the door softly behind me, and I sat down on a cream-colored settee that was probably worth more than my car, and I felt the weight of every single time my family had made me feel like this settle onto my shoulders, like a coat I'd been wearing so long I sometimes forgot I could take it off. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The sitting room was decorated in shades of ivory and pale blue, colors that had probably been chosen by some expensive interior designer to be soothing. But the effect on me was anything but soothing, as I sat there listening to the muffled voices coming from the library down the hall. Voices that rose and fell in patterns I couldn't quite decipher, but that felt important, felt like they were discussing things that should have included me, but somehow didn't. I could hear my mother's voice occasionally, that particular pitch she used when she was being authoritative, and once I heard Trevor laugh at something, a bark of sound that carried through the heavy doors and down the corridor to where I waited like a child, sent to sit in the hallway outside the principal's office. My relationship with Grandma Rose had always felt like something I couldn't quite get into focus. Like one of those optical illusions where you see two different images depending on how you look at it. There had been moments, scattered through my childhood and adult life like bright coins on a dark floor, when I'd felt certain that she saw me, really saw me, in a way the rest of the family never did. I remembered being 14 and finding her in the garden behind the estate, working in the flower beds herself, despite having a team of landscapers, her hands in the dirt, and she'd looked up at me and patted the ground beside her. And for an hour, she'd taught me about roses, about how the most beautiful ones required patience and careful attention, how you couldn't force them to bloom faster than they were ready to, how sometimes the ones that looked weakest in the beginning turned out to be the strongest. She'd asked me questions that day, real questions, about what I wanted to study, about the books I was reading, about whether I thought I might want to teach someday. And when I said yes, maybe, she'd nodded like I'd said something profound instead of something foolish, which is how my mother had reacted when I'd mentioned teaching at dinner the night before. But then there were the other memories, the ones that made me question whether I'd imagined that connection, whether I'd built up a relationship in my head that didn't really exist because I was so desperate for someone in my family to see value in me. Madison's wedding had been 6 years ago, a massive affair at the country club with 300 guests and flowers that cost more than my annual salary, and at the reception I'd watched Grandma Rose hand Madison an envelope. Watched Madison open it and squeal with delight, watched her show Trevor the check inside, $50,000, and I'd felt happy for my sister, genuinely happy, because I'd never been the jealous type. Then at my own wedding, 8 months later, a small ceremony in David's parents' backyard with 40 guests and flowers from the farmer's market, Grandma Rose had handed me an envelope too, and inside was a check for $500 and a note that said best wishes, and I'd told myself it didn't matter, that she'd probably spent so much on Madison's wedding that she needed to be more careful with money, that $500 was still generous, that I was being ungrateful to even notice the disparity. The mental gymnastics I'd performed to make that make sense, to make it not hurt, could have won Olympic medals. And then there were the last 5 years, after Grandma's dementia diagnosis, when I'd tried so hard to visit her, to be there for her the way she'd been there for me in those garden moments I'd clung to. But every time I'd called to arrange a visit, I'd been told it wasn't a good time, that she was having a bad day, that she was resting, that the doctors said not too many visitors, that Trevor and Madison had just been there and she was tired. I'd made it to see her exactly 3 times in 5 years, and each time she'd looked at me with confusion, sometimes thinking I was a nurse, once asking if I was there to clean the windows, and the guilt of that sat in my chest like a stone, because I kept thinking if I'd tried harder, if I'd just shown up without calling, if I'd been more insistent, maybe I could have had more time with her before the disease took her away completely. Trevor and Madison always talked about their weekly visits, about how Grandma knew them right up until the end, about the conversations they'd had and the memories they'd shared, and I'd felt that familiar sensation of being on the outside looking in, wondering if I'd failed her or if I'd been failed, unable to tell the difference anymore. The funeral had been 3 weeks ago, and sitting in that side room waiting to be told I could leave, I kept replaying it in my mind, like a film I couldn't stop watching, even though I knew how much it was going to hurt. I'd arrived at the church 40 minutes early because I'd been terrified of being late, of giving anyone another reason to look at me with that particular expression my family had perfected. The one that said I was always somehow getting things wrong, and I'd walked into the church expecting to find it mostly empty, but instead found it already half full, found that apparently everyone else had arrived even earlier, found that the first 3 rows had been reserved for family, and they were already occupied by people I was related to by blood, but who felt like strangers who happened to know my name. My mother, Patricia, sat in the center of the front row, wearing a black suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her hair perfect, her makeup flawless even in grief, and on either side of her sat Trevor and Madison, and scattered through the next 2 rows were aunts and uncles and cousins I saw maybe once a year at obligatory gatherings, where I always felt like I was attending someone else's family reunion. I'd stood there in the aisle holding the service program that had Grandma Rose's photograph on the front, a professional portrait from maybe 10 years ago where she looked dignified and distant. And I'd waited for someone to notice me, to wave me forward, to make space, but no one did. And finally I'd walked to the back of the church and sat in the last row next to people I didn't know, people who were probably business associates or friends of friends, and I'd felt that familiar burn in my chest that I'd learned to recognize as the particular species of pain that comes from being excluded by the people who are supposed to love you most. David had found me there 20 minutes later, had slid into the pew beside me and taken my hand without saying anything, because he'd learned over our 7 years together that sometimes there was nothing to say, that sometimes the only thing he could offer was his presence and the warmth of his palm against mine, and I'd held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a room that kept tilting sideways. After the service, at the reception at the estate, I'd tried to approach my mother to offer condolences, or comfort, or whatever you were supposed to offer, and Patricia had looked at me with eyes that were dry, despite the tears she'd cried so convincingly during the eulogy she'd delivered about what a wonderful mother-in-law Rose had been. And she'd said in a voice loud enough for my cousins Janet and Sarah to hear, "Well, at least you made it to this family event." And the implication hung in the air like smoke, the suggestion that I was somehow always absent, always choosing not to participate, rather than the reality that I was rarely invited or actively discouraged from attending. I'd tried to explain, had started to say something about how I'd tried to visit Grandma more, how I'd called every week, how I'd been told again and again that it wasn't a good time, but Madison had rolled her eyes in that way she'd perfected sometime around age 13, and Trevor had made a dismissive sound and said, "Sure, Emma," in a tone that suggested he didn't believe a word I was saying, that my version of events was just another example of me playing the victim, and I'd felt David's hand tighten around mine and heard him say quietly, "Maybe we should go." But I'd stayed another hour anyway, because some part of me still believed that if I just tried hard enough, if I just showed up enough, if I just proved myself enough, they would eventually see me as worth including. On the drive home, David had been quiet for a long time before finally saying, "Emma, I love you, and I'll support whatever you decide, but maybe it's time to let them go." And I'd felt something inside me resist that idea with surprising force, because letting them go felt like admitting defeat, like agreeing that I was what they seemed to think I was, like accepting that I would never have the family I'd always wanted, and I wasn't ready to do that, wasn't sure I would ever be ready. My life had become something I was genuinely proud of, even if my family couldn't see it, even if to them it looked like failure dressed up in modest clothing. I taught fourth grade at Lincoln Elementary, made $48,000 a year, which wasn't much by my family's standards, but felt like enough for the life David and I had built together. David worked for a nonprofit that provided legal services to low-income families, made $42,000 a year, and together we lived in an 800-square-foot apartment in a neighborhood my mother had once described as transitional, in a tone that made clear she didn't mean it as a compliment, and we were happy in a way that felt real and earned rather than purchased. I volunteered at the Community Literacy Center 2 Saturdays a month, teaching adults who'd slipped through the cracks of the education system how to read, and every time one of my students successfully worked their way through a sentence that had been impossible to them a month before, I felt a satisfaction that I suspected my siblings had never experienced in their lives of acquisition and status. My students knew my name, made me cards on holidays, hugged me in the grocery store when they saw me, and that felt like success even if my family saw it as settling. My phone buzzed in my lap where I'd been sitting in that side room for what felt like hours, but had probably been 40 minutes, and when I looked down, I saw Madison's name on the screen with a text message that said, "This is taking forever, typical grandma drama." And the fact that she'd texted me directly, instead of in whatever family group chat I wasn't included in, felt almost more jarring than the dismissive tone, "Because Madison never texted me, we went months without direct communication," and I stared at the message for a long moment, trying to decide if I should respond or what I could possibly say that wouldn't sound either pathetic or angry. And finally, I just locked my phone and set it face down on the table beside me, because there was no good answer to a message like that, no way to engage that wouldn't somehow make me feel smaller. Sitting there in the silence broken only by the muffled voices from down the hall, my mind kept circling back to things I'd buried over the years, memories I'd filed away under "not helpful to dwell on," but that kept surfacing anyway like objects floating up from the bottom of a lake. Grandma Rose had built her real estate empire from absolutely nothing, a fact that everyone in the family knew, but that seemed to mean different things to different people. And I'd always been fascinated by her story, in a way I don't think Trevor or Madison ever were, because to them she was just Grandma who happened to be rich. But to me, she was this figure who represented the possibility of transformation, of becoming something other than what you started as. She'd been widowed at 23 when my grandfather, a construction worker, had died in an accident on a job site, and she'd been left with a 2-year-old son, my father, and no education past 8th grade because she'd dropped out to help support her own family during the Depression. The story I'd pieced together from things she'd mentioned over the years, and things I'd overheard, was that she'd started cleaning houses, then managing properties for an elderly landlord who'd taken a chance on her, then buying her first building with money she'd saved dollar by dollar over 5 years. And from there, she'd built an empire through sheer force of will and an ability to see potential in properties that other people overlooked, which I'd always thought was maybe why she'd seen something in me that the rest of the family missed. Because she understood about hidden value, about things that didn't look impressive on the surface, but that had solid foundations underneath. I remembered her asking me about my teaching with an intensity that had felt unusual. Not just the polite questions adults ask to fill silence, but real detailed questions about my methods, about how I approach students who were struggling with reading, about what I did when traditional approaches didn't work, and she'd told me once about teaching herself to read at the public library when she was in her 20s, about how humiliating it had felt to be an adult who could barely sound out words, about the patient librarian who'd helped her without making her feel stupid, and I'd seen tears in her eyes when she'd said, "Education is the only thing nobody can take away from you, Emma. The only thing that's really yours." Those conversations felt significant now in a way I hadn't fully appreciated at the time, like she'd been trying to tell me something I was too busy feeling excluded by everyone else to properly hear. The door to the side room opened, and a young woman in a gray suit, probably one of the estate lawyer's assistants, came in carrying a glass of water on a small silver tray, and she set it on the table beside me, with a look on her face that I initially read as pity, that same expression people got when they were watching someone experience something embarrassing or painful and felt uncomfortable witnessing it. But there was something else in her eyes, too. Something I couldn't quite identify, and she said, "It shouldn't be much longer," in a tone that struck me as odd, not quite pitying, almost like she was trying not to smile, and I thanked her automatically, and she left and I sat there feeling confused about what I'd just seen in her expression. Like there was some joke I wasn't in on, which was such a familiar feeling in my family that I almost didn't register it as strange. The door to the library opened and I heard it before I saw it. The heavy oak door with its brass hinges that probably cost more than my monthly salary making that particular sound I remembered from childhood visits to the estate. And then they were emerging into the hallway, and I could see them through the doorway of the side room, where I'd been sitting for nearly an hour, and Trevor came out first, looking like someone had just told him his stock portfolio had crashed, his face red and his jaw clenched in that way that meant he was absolutely furious, but trying to maintain composure in front of people who mattered. And Madison was right behind him, looking pale and clutching a stack of papers against her chest, like they were somehow going to escape if she didn't hold them tightly enough. And then my mother Patricia appeared, and her face was doing that thing it did when she was trying not to lose her temper in public, that pinched expression around her mouth and eyes that made her look 10 years older. And they walked right past the open door of the side room where I was sitting, walked past without even glancing in my direction, like I was a piece of furniture they'd learned to navigate around years ago. And I heard their footsteps heading toward what I knew was the sitting room further down the hall, and the sound of their voices already rising, in what was clearly going to be an argument about whatever they'd just heard. I stood up uncertainly, because no one had told me I could leave, but also no one had told me to stay, and I wasn't sure what the protocol was supposed to be in this situation. Whether I was supposed to just let myself out or wait for permission, or what exactly my role was now that the official reading had apparently concluded without me, and I was standing there in the middle of the small room feeling ridiculous and trying to decide what to do when Mr. Harrison appeared in the doorway, and he was a man in his mid-60s with silver hair and one of those faces that somehow managed to look both dignified and kind at the same time, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly and holding a leather portfolio under one arm. And he looked at me with an expression that was completely different from any expression anyone in my family had ever directed at me, something that looked almost like respect. And he said, "Ms. Emma, would you please come into the library now?" And his tone was warm and professional and made me feel like I was actually a person whose presence mattered rather than an inconvenience to be managed. I followed him down the hall past the closed door of the sitting room where I could hear my mother's voice rising in pitch, something about percentages and fair distribution, and into the library where I'd played as a child, that room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the massive oak desk that had been my grandfather's, and the leather chairs that smelled like old paper and furniture polish. And Mr. Harrison gestured to one of the chairs positioned in front of the desk, not the small, uncomfortable chair off to the side, but one of the good chairs, the ones that family members sat in. And I sat down feeling confused and slightly dizzy because nothing about this made sense given what Trevor had said about me not needing to attend. Mr. Harrison settled himself behind the desk and opened his portfolio with deliberate care, and he looked at me with those kind eyes and said, "I apologize for the delay, Ms. Emma. Your grandmother was very specific about the order of the proceedings." And I just nodded, because I didn't trust my voice yet, and wasn't sure what I was supposed to say to that, and he continued. What just concluded was the reading of Mrs. Blackwell's public will, the document filed with probate court that details the distribution of her primary estate. And he paused like he was making sure I was following along, and I nodded again even though I still had no idea where this was going. And he said, "The estate includes the family home, which will be divided between your mother Patricia and your uncle James, the commercial real estate holdings, which will be managed by the existing family trust, with shares distributed among the grandchildren, various stock portfolios, and several charitable bequests." And I thought, okay, so that's what they'd all been hearing. That's why Trevor looked angry, because probably the distribution wasn't what he'd expected, or Uncle James got more than Trevor thought was fair, and I was already starting to stand up, because clearly this had nothing to do with me, and I could leave now. But Mr. Harrison held up one hand in a gesture that stopped me, and he said, "And now we proceed to the matter of the Rosemary Blackwell Irrevocable Trust, established in 2019. I sat there staring at Mr. Harrison, because the words Rosemary Blackwell Irrevocable Trust, established in 2019, were coming out of his mouth. But they didn't make any sense to me, didn't connect to anything I knew about my grandmother or my family or my place in any of it. And I heard myself say, "I don't know what that is," in a voice that sounded very small and far away, like I was listening to myself from the bottom of a well. Mr. Harrison's expression remained professional, but something shifted in his eyes, something that looked almost like satisfaction, and he said, "4 years ago, approximately 18 months before your grandmother's dementia diagnosis, Mrs. Braitse Blackwell created a separate trust instrument that was completely legal and properly executed, but entirely private." And he paused to let that sink in before continuing. "Your grandmother was very clear in her instructions to me that the details of this trust were to remain absolutely confidential until after the public will had been read and your family members had left the premises." And the way he said "your family members," as if I wasn't included in that category, made something twist in my chest, confusion mixing with a feeling I couldn't quite name. He reached into his portfolio and withdrew a thick folder, the kind of expensive leather document holder that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and he slid it across the polished surface of the oak desk toward me with the kind of care you'd use handling something fragile or precious. And my hands were shaking when I reached for it, actually visibly trembling in a way that embarrassed me, but that I couldn't seem to control. And when I opened the folder and looked at the first page, I stopped breathing entirely, because there at the top in formal legal language was trust value as of date of death, and underneath that, a number that I had to read 3 times before my brain would accept that it was real. $3.2 million in cash, bonds, and dividend-producing stocks. The room tilted slightly, and I gripped the edge of the desk because I thought I might actually pass out. And somewhere very far away, I heard Mr. Harrison's voice saying, "This represents approximately 60% of your grandmother's liquid assets, Ms. Emma. The real estate and business holdings went through the public will, as you heard referenced, but Mrs. Blackwell was very deliberate and intentional about separating out this portion of her estate." And I couldn't make sense of what he was saying because the number kept swimming in front of my eyes. $3.2 million. And that was more money than I would earn in my entire lifetime of teaching. More money than I could properly conceptualize. And my grandmother, who had given me $500 for my wedding while giving Madison $50,000, had somehow set aside $3.2 million in a trust I'd never heard of. I looked up at Mr. Harrison and heard myself whisper, "I don't understand," because I genuinely didn't. Couldn't make the pieces fit together into any pattern that made sense. And his expression softened in a way that made him look less like a lawyer and more like someone's kind grandfather. And he said, "There's a letter, Ms. Emma. Your grandmother asked that you read it before we continue with any further details." And he reached into the folder and withdrew a cream-colored envelope that was sealed with what looked like actual wax, old-fashioned and formal, and on the front, in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting that I recognized from birthday cards, and the occasional note was just my name, Emma. I broke the wax seal with my thumb, and it crumbled away in little red flakes that fell onto the polished surface of the desk, and I lifted the folded pages from the envelope with hands that were trembling so badly I almost dropped them. And the paper was thick and expensive, the kind of stationery my grandmother had always used for important correspondence. And when I unfolded the letter, I saw her handwriting covering both sides of 2 full pages, that distinctive script that had become shakier in her later years, but was still unmistakably hers, still carrying that quality of determination and precision that had characterized everything she did. And at the top of the first page were the words, "My dearest Emma." And seeing my name in her handwriting made something crack open inside my chest, because she'd written this knowing I would read it after she was gone, had sat down while she was still herself, and composed these words specifically for me to find in exactly this moment. I took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, and began to read. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I can finally tell you the truth I couldn't say while living." And the tears started immediately, blurring the words so I had to blink hard to clear my vision. And I continued reading as my grandmother's voice seemed to come through the page, explaining in her direct way that she had been watching the family dynamics for years, had seen exactly how they treated me, how Patricia, who was her daughter-in-law, married to Rose's late son Thomas, had systematically excluded me for not fitting in with what she called the family image. And Rose wrote that she had gone along with it in public because she wanted to keep peace, because she was tired and didn't want the constant battle that standing up for me would have required, but that doing so had corroded her soul, and she had carried the guilt of her silence for years. She mentioned the wedding gift disparity specifically, wrote that she had given me only $500 publicly because she knew if she'd given me the same amount as Madison, then Madison and Patricia would have mocked me for it, would have found some way to make it ugly. But what no one knew was that she had been putting $1,000 a month into a separate account in my name for 15 years, ever since I was 17, and she'd seen how the family dynamic was solidifying against me, and those garden conversations we'd had, those moments when she asked me detailed questions about my teaching methods and my students, and particularly about the struggling readers I worked with. Those hadn't been just polite interest or casual conversation. They had been her way of building a private relationship with me that the rest of the family knew nothing about. A relationship that existed in the spaces between their awareness, in the quiet moments they dismissed as unimportant. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and forced myself to keep reading because the letter wasn't finished yet, and I needed to see all of what she'd written, needed to understand the full scope of what she was trying to tell me. And the next section began, "You became a teacher, Emma." And just seeing those words in her handwriting made something swell in my chest because she said it like it was an accomplishment, like it was something to be proud of rather than the disappointment my mother had always treated it as. And she continued, "You chose a life of service over money, you chose purpose over prestige, and you did it knowing your family would judge you for it, would treat you as less than because of it." And I could hear her voice in the words, that distinctive blend of bluntness and affection that had always characterized how she spoke. She wrote about David next, about how I'd married a good man who works in nonprofit management instead of one of the country club boys Patricia kept pushing at you, those empty young men with trust funds and entitlement and nothing of substance inside them. And I remembered those awful dinners my mother had arranged when I was in my 20s, the parade of suitable men she'd tried to set me up with, men who talked about their portfolios and their connections, and looked at me like I was a peculiar specimen they couldn't quite figure out, and how she'd been so angry when I'd brought David home instead. David, with his degree in social work and his job at a housing nonprofit, and his genuine smile and his complete lack of interest in impressing anyone. Rose wrote, "You live in an 800 square foot apartment, and you're happy, genuinely happy, and do you know how rare that is, Emma? How precious?" And I realized she'd noticed that, had seen during her few visits to our tiny place how David and I moved around each other with easy affection, how our bookshelf was crammed with second-hand books we'd actually read, how our furniture was mismatched but comfortable, how there was laughter in those small rooms and contentment, and something real that her big house with its expensive furnishings had never contained. And she wrote, "I spent 40 years in rooms full of beautiful things, and I was never as happy as you are in your little apartment with your teacher husband and your used couch, and watching you stay kind, stay genuine, stay true to yourself, despite years of subtle and overt rejection from the family. That convinced me that you were the only grandchild who understood what really mattered in life." My hands were shaking so badly the paper rustled, and I had to set it down on the desk for a moment to catch my breath. And Mr. Harrison sat quietly across from me with an expression of infinite patience, like he'd seen this reaction before or had expected it. And after a few seconds, I picked up the letter again because I had to know the rest. Rose's next words were stark and painful in their honesty. "Trevor is entitled, Emma. He always has been. He takes and believes the world owes him everything simply because he exists. And Madison is shallow. She measures her worth by her clothes and her house and her social media followers, and I don't think she's ever had a genuine thought in her life." And seeing my grandmother write those words about her other grandchildren should have shocked me. But instead it felt like validation, like someone finally saying out loud what I'd always sensed but never been allowed to acknowledge. And she continued, "I love them because they're blood, because they're my son's grandchildren just as you are. But I don't admire them, Emma. I don't respect the people they've become. And if I'm honest with myself, I don't even particularly like them." And then came the words that broke me completely. "You, Emma, I admire you. I respect you. I like the person you are, and I am so deeply proud to be your grandmother." I was sobbing now, couldn't hold it back, and Mr. Harrison pushed the tissue box closer without saying anything, just let me cry while I clutched my grandmother's letter and felt the weight of words I'd waited my whole life to hear from someone in my family. And when I could see clearly enough to continue reading, Rose explained the practical details in her characteristic direct way. The $3.2 million in the trust was mine, solely mine, unconditionally mine, no strings attached, and no requirements except that I use it in whatever way brought me peace or joy or purpose or security. And then she wrote, "But there's more, Emma. There's something else I need you to know about." And my heart was racing because what more could there possibly be? And she explained that in 2018, she had purchased a small building in my neighborhood under an LLC, had done it quietly without telling anyone in the family, and the building housed a struggling community literacy center on the ground floor with two residential units sitting empty above it. And she wrote the address, and I recognized it immediately because I'd walked past that building hundreds of times, had even volunteered at the literacy center there a few times over the years. And Rose wrote, "The building is worth approximately $800,000 based on the current market assessment. And Emma, it's yours too. I'm deeding it to you along with everything else because I knew you'd understand what to do with it. Knew you'd see its value not in dollars but in impact, in the lives changed by the work that happens there." The final section of the letter began with my grandmother's explanation of her reasoning, and her words were so clear and deliberate that I could almost hear her voice speaking them aloud in that matter-of-fact tone she'd always used when discussing business decisions. She wrote, "The rest of the family gets the flashy assets, Emma, the things that look impressive on paper and make for good conversation at parties. The family home with its 6 bedrooms and its historical register plaque. The commercial properties with their prestigious addresses. The business holdings that come with the Blackwell name attached. All the visible symbols of wealth and status that your mother and brother and sister value so highly." And I could picture her sitting at her desk composing these words, probably in her private study, where she'd handled all her real business away from the family's observation, and she continued, "But you get the invisible wealth, the kind that provides actual freedom and real security rather than just the appearance of it, the kind of wealth that gives you choices instead of obligations, that opens doors instead of closing you into the box of family expectations." She explained that she was giving me what she wished someone had given her at my age, back when she was a young widow with an 8th-grade education trying to figure out how to survive. And she listed the possibilities this money created. You can quit teaching if it stops bringing you joy. If the bureaucracy and the testing mandates and the lack of resources finally wear you down, the way they wear down so many good teachers, you can walk away without fear because you'll have security waiting for you. And then, you can travel, really travel, not the performative luxury vacations your sister takes so she can post photos, but the kind of travel that changes you, that shows you different ways of living and being in the world. And you can have children without worrying about daycare costs, or whether you can afford to take maternity leave, or how you'll pay for college someday. You can make choices based on what you want, rather than what you can afford. And then she added, "Or you can keep teaching because you love it, because it feeds something essential in you, and simply breathe easier, knowing that you're doing it by choice rather than necessity. That you have a foundation of security underneath you that lets you focus on your students instead of lying awake at night worrying about your checking account balance." Then she addressed the Literacy Center building directly, and her words carried a weight of personal meaning that made me understand this wasn't just a financial asset to her, but something that represented her own history and values. "The building, Emma, I bought it because the Literacy Center was going to be evicted, and I couldn't stand the thought of those programs disappearing, of adults who were finally getting the chance to learn to read, losing that opportunity because of money. Because I was one of those adults once, learning to read properly in my 20s in the public library after my husband died, and I realized I couldn't build a business if I could barely get through a contract. And I hadn't known that about her, hadn't known the full extent of her educational struggles, and she wrote, I've been their landlord for 6 years, charging them barely enough to cover the property taxes and basic maintenance because that program matters more than profit, and now you're their landlord, Emma, and you can do with that what you will, but I trust you to see the value in what they do there, to understand that some things matter more than their monetary worth." The letter was coming to its end now, and I could feel it in the shift of her tone, the way she moved from practical explanations to something more emotional and raw. And she wrote, "I couldn't be the grandmother you deserved while I was alive, Emma. I couldn't stand up to your mother the way I should have, couldn't defend you publicly when she belittled your choices or when Trevor and Madison treated you as less than. I was too weak, too tired, too concerned with avoiding conflict and keeping a surface peace that benefited everyone except you." And seeing her acknowledge that, seeing her take responsibility for her own complicity in my exclusion, hurt almost more than the exclusion itself had, because it confirmed that she'd seen it happening and had chosen her own comfort over my protection. But then she continued, "I'm sorry, Emma. I'm so deeply sorry for every time I stayed silent when I should have spoken, for every time I let them diminish you without consequence, for not being brave enough to show them that I valued you differently and more than I valued them." And I was crying so hard now that the tears were falling onto the paper, and I was terrified of damaging her words. And the final paragraph began. "But I could do this. I could make sure you were protected and provided for. I could create a foundation of security that no one could take from you. I could give you the freedom to live your life on your own terms without needing anything from people who have never appreciated you. And I could, in the end, tell you the truth. I should have told you every day of your life." And then came the words that I knew I would carry with me for the rest of my days, the words that would replay in my mind during every moment of doubt or pain. "You were always my favorite, Emma. Not because of anything you did or achieved, but because of who you are, because of your kindness and your integrity and your genuine care for others, because you chose meaning over money and love over status and purpose over prestige, and you were always enough, more than enough. You were exactly right just as you were. You never needed to change or prove yourself or earn anyone's approval, including mine, because you were already complete and valuable and worthy exactly as you stood." The letter ended with simply, "With all my love, Grandma Rose," and her signature, that distinctive scrawl that had signed checks and contracts and built an empire. And I sat there holding these pages that represented the only inheritance that had ever really mattered. The knowledge that someone had seen me and valued me and loved me for exactly who I was. I was sobbing so hard now that I couldn't see the paper anymore, couldn't make out the words through the blur of tears that just kept coming, no matter how many times I tried to wipe them away, and my whole body was shaking with the force of emotions I'd been holding back for what felt like my entire life. Grief and relief and gratitude and pain all tangled together into something so overwhelming I could barely breathe through it. Mr. Harrison sat quietly across the massive oak desk from me, with an expression of such patient understanding that it made me cry harder, because even this stranger, this attorney who'd only met me an hour ago, was showing me more kindness and consideration than my own family ever had. And he reached across the polished wood surface to slide the box of tissues closer to me without saying a word, just letting me fall apart in his dignified library while the late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows and illuminated the dust motes floating in the air. I pulled tissue after tissue from the box, pressing them against my face, trying to compose myself enough to speak, because there were questions crowding my mind now underneath all the emotion. Practical concerns pushing through the overwhelming feeling of being seen and valued and loved by my grandmother, in a way I'd never quite believed was real while she was alive. When I could finally draw a breath that didn't hitch in my throat, when I could see clearly enough to focus on Mr. Harrison's kind face across from me, I managed to ask the question that mattered most in terms of immediate consequences. "Do they know? My family, do they know about any of this?" And my voice came out rough and broken, barely above a whisper. Mr. Harrison shook his head slowly and deliberately, and something in his expression told me he'd been expecting this question, had probably prepared his answer in advance. "The trust was completely separate from the probated will, Emma," he said, using my first name with a familiarity that felt earned somehow, felt appropriate given what we'd just shared in this room. "It's a private legal instrument that doesn't go through the public court system the way a standard will does. And your grandmother was extremely deliberate about structuring it that way, precisely to keep the details confidential from the rest of the family." He leaned forward slightly, his clasped hands resting on the desk, and continued, "It will eventually become part of the public record when we file the appropriate tax documents and transfer paperwork. That's unavoidable given the amounts involved and the property transfer. But that won't happen for several months at minimum, possibly longer depending on how quickly we process everything. And your grandmother was very specific in her instructions to me that she wanted you to have time to process this privately, to adjust to your new circumstances, and make whatever decisions you needed to make before dealing with their inevitable reactions. I felt something loosen in my chest at his words, some tight knot of anxiety I hadn't even fully registered I was carrying, because the thought of facing my mother and Trevor and Madison right now, of having to defend or explain or justify my grandmother's choices while I was still trying to understand them myself, felt completely impossible, and the fact that Rose had anticipated that and protected me from it made me want to cry all over again. Mr. Harrison stood and walked to the far wall where a large safe was built into the bookshelf, and he began entering a combination as he spoke over his shoulder to me. Now, let me walk you through the practical details, because I know the emotional impact is enormous, but you need to understand the mechanics of what your grandmother set up. He explained as he worked the safe dial that the trust funds were already deposited in investment and savings accounts that had been established in my name months ago, back in June actually. Accounts that had been sitting there accruing interest, but were inaccessible to me until the specific conditions of the trust were met, namely Rose's death and the completion of the public will reading. The money is yours now, completely and legally yours, and while our firm will continue to manage the investments if you wish, you have full control and access starting today, he said. And hearing those words made it feel suddenly real in a way it hadn't before. Not abstract numbers on a page, but actual money that I could access, could use, could make decisions about. He turned back to face me with a small wooden box in his hands, maybe 8 inches square, made of dark polished wood, with a delicate brass lock on the front, and he set it on the desk between us with careful reverence. The building deed transfer is already in process and will be complete within 2 weeks. Just some standard paperwork and title searches, nothing you need to worry about. Our office is handling all of that, he continued, and then he gestured to the box. But there are also some specific items your grandmother wanted you to have, personal items that weren't included in the formal trust documentation because she kept them hidden, stored them here in my office safe actually, and she gave me very specific instructions about when and how to give them to you. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small brass key, the kind that might open an antique jewelry box or a diary, and I recognized it immediately because there had been a matching key tucked into the envelope with Rose's letter. And I fumbled in my purse with shaking hands until I found it, held it up to show him. "That's the one," Mr. Harrison said with a small smile that transformed his dignified features into something warmer, almost grandfatherly, and he pushed the wooden box across the desk toward me. "Your grandmother wanted you to open this in private, but she also wanted me to be here when you first saw the contents, to provide context if needed, and to answer any questions that might arise, so please take your time, there's no rush." I picked up the box, and it was heavier than I'd expected, solid and substantial in my hands, and the wood was smooth and cool against my palms, clearly old, clearly valuable, the kind of thing that had been carefully maintained for decades. And I had to try the key twice because my hands were still trembling so badly. But finally the lock clicked open with a soft metallic sound that seemed very loud in the quiet library. Inside the box was a collection of items that looked modest at first glance, but carried a weight of meaning that hit me as powerfully as the trust documents had. And my hands trembled as I lifted out each piece and set it carefully on Mr. Harrison's desk, where the afternoon light could illuminate what my grandmother had chosen to preserve and pass on to me. The first item was a ring, a simple gold band that was thin and slightly worn, the metal carrying the patina of decades of wear, and Mr. Harrison said quietly, "That's your grandmother's original wedding ring, from her first marriage when she was 19 years old. Not the large diamond setting that the family knew about from her second marriage, but the ring she wore when she married your grandfather Thomas, when she was still Rosemarie Patterson and had nothing but hope and determination." I slipped it onto my finger and it fit perfectly on my right hand, and the weight of it felt significant despite its simplicity, like I was carrying a piece of her history and her beginning before she became the formidable Rose Blackwell that everyone knew. Beneath the ring was a strand of pearls, creamy and luminous, clearly real and clearly old, and when I lifted them, the weight and warmth of them told me they'd been worn often, loved, and Mr. Harrison explained, she wore those pearls to every major business meeting for 30 years, said they reminded her of where she'd started and how far she'd come. And she wanted you to have them because she said you understood the value of things that aren't flashy, but are real. But it was the photographs that completely undid me. A thick stack of pictures held together with a rubber band that had grown brittle with age, and when I slipped it off and began looking through the images, I found myself staring at a version of my grandmother I'd never seen before, a young woman who looked vibrant and alive and full of fierce defiance, her eyes bright and her smile wide and genuine in a way I'd never witnessed in person. There was a photograph dated 1952 on the back in faded pencil, showing a young Rose sitting at a library table with books spread around her and a look of intense concentration on her face as she worked through what must have been a reading lesson, teaching herself the skills she'd missed as a child, and seeing that image of her determination and her willingness to admit she needed to learn made me understand where her respect for education had come from, why she'd asked me such detailed questions about my teaching methods and my struggling readers. Another photo showed her in 1968 standing in front of a small storefront office with Blackwell Properties painted on the window. And she was wearing a conservative dress and holding a briefcase and looking simultaneously terrified and determined, a woman stepping into a world that probably didn't want her there but doing it anyway. And I realized this must have been her first real estate office, the beginning of the empire she'd built through sheer force of will. But then I found the photographs of me, dozens of them tucked throughout the stack, and I hadn't known these existed, hadn't known she'd been documenting my life in this private way. And there I was at my college graduation in my cap and gown, looking young and hopeful, and I remembered that day and remembered that Rose had come, even though the rest of the family had been too busy. And there was another photo from my wedding day, where David and I were laughing at something off camera and looking completely happy in a way that was unposed and genuine, and seeing myself through her eyes, seeing what she'd chosen to capture and keep, made me understand that she'd been paying attention in ways I'd never fully grasped. The photograph that broke me completely was one I definitely hadn't known existed, an image of me in my classroom taken through the window from outside. And I was sitting on the edge of my desk with a book in my hands, and my students gathered around me on the carpet in a semicircle, all of us engaged in whatever story I was reading, and the photo captured something essential about who I was and what I valued. And when I turned it over, I found Rose's handwriting on the back, just 5 words that she must have written years ago. This is what success looks like. I broke down completely then, not from sadness, but from something else entirely, something that felt like all the years of holding myself together and swallowing their casual cruelty and pretending their words didn't cut me were finally catching up with me all at once. And I sat there in my little Honda Civic in the circular driveway of my grandmother's enormous estate, with my hands still trembling so badly I had to grip the steering wheel to steady them. And I realized that everything had changed in the last 2 hours, in ways I was only beginning to understand. I could hear voices from inside the house, raised and angry, carrying through the expensive windows that lined the sitting room where my family had gathered after the will reading, and I recognized my mother's sharp tone even muffled by distance and glass, that particular pitch she got when she felt she'd been slighted or cheated, when things hadn't gone exactly the way she'd expected them to go. And I knew they were in there right now, picking apart the terms of Rose's public will and complaining about the distribution and probably saying terrible things about their own mother, who'd just died 3 weeks ago and who'd spent her entire life building the wealth they were now fighting over. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands and pulled up my text messages, found David's name at the top of my recent contacts, and typed out, "Can you come get me? I'll leave the car here. I need you," with fingers that could barely hit the right keys. and I didn't try to explain or give him context because I literally couldn't find the words yet, couldn't begin to articulate what had just happened in Mr. Harrison's library. The trust and the letter and the photographs and the complete reordering of everything I thought I understood about my grandmother and my place in my family. While I waited for David to respond, my phone buzzed in my hand with a notification, and I glanced down to see a group text message that I apparently had been included on, which was strange because I was never included in the family group chat. And when I opened it, I saw it was from Trevor, and the message said, "Can you believe she left Uncle James 40% of the business? Mom is losing her mind. At least the teacher didn't get anything LOL." And the casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. The way he referred to me as the teacher, even when talking to Madison, not even using my name, reducing me to my profession that they all looked down on, and treating my exclusion from the inheritance as a joke, something worth laughing about. Madison had already responded by the time I finished reading Trevor's message, her text popping up beneath his with a little typing bubble that made my stomach clench, and her words were somehow even worse. Emma looked so pathetic sitting in that side room, I almost felt bad, almost followed by that laughing emoji that she probably thought was hilarious, that casual dismissal of my humanity and my feelings wrapped up in a tiny yellow face, and I stared at those messages on my phone screen and realized they must have added me to this text thread by accident, that they'd never intended for me to see this conversation, never thought I'd read their real opinions about me expressed so casually and cruelly when they thought I wasn't listening. 20 minutes ago, maybe even 10 minutes ago, reading those texts would have destroyed me completely, would have confirmed every terrible thing I'd ever thought about myself and my worth in their eyes, would have sent me spiraling into that familiar place of hurt and self-doubt where I'd spent so much of my life. But now, as I sat there in my aging Honda surrounded by their luxury cars and their casual wealth, with the knowledge of my grandmother's trust sitting heavy and real in the folder on my passenger seat, those words felt distant somehow, like they were about someone else entirely, some other Emma who still believed their opinions mattered, who still cared what they thought. I saw David's car turn into the driveway before I'd even registered that he'd responded to my text. And he must have dropped everything and jumped straight in his car the moment he got my message. And when he pulled up next to me and got out and saw my face through the window, his expression transformed into something so full of love and concern that I started crying again. And he opened my door and pulled me out of the car and into his arms, right there in my grandmother's driveway, holding me while I shook and couldn't speak. "What happened?" he asked quietly against my hair, his arms steady and solid around me, and I couldn't answer him yet, so I just reached back into the car and grabbed the folder that Mr. Harrison had given me. The thick legal document that contained the trust papers, and my grandmother's letter and the building deed and the proof that I had been seen and valued and loved in ways I'd never fully understood. And I pressed it into David's hands because I needed him to know, needed him to understand what had just happened, even though I couldn't yet find the words to explain it. We got home to our apartment around 7 that evening, and the contrast between the vast estate I'd just left and our modest 800 square foot space had never felt more stark. Though for the first time in my life, that difference didn't make me feel ashamed or lesser, but rather like I was stepping into something real and honest and mine, and David helped me inside because my legs were still shaky, and my hands couldn't seem to stop trembling even though we'd been in the car for 40 minutes, and I'd had time to start processing what had happened. We spread the trust documents across our tiny kitchen table, the one we'd bought secondhand from a couple on Craigslist 3 years ago, the surface scratched and worn but sturdy in ours, and David pulled out the folder's contents carefully and methodically, organizing the papers in neat stacks while I sat there watching him and trying to make my brain work properly again, trying to reconcile the numbers I'd seen with any version of reality I understood. David kept saying, "Oh my God," as he read through each document, his voice getting quieter and more awed with each page, and he went through the trust paperwork first, his eyes scanning the legal language and the account balances and the investment portfolios, And then he picked up my grandmother's letter with hands that were gentler than I'd ever seen him handle anything, and he read it silently while I watched his face transform, watched his eyes fill with tears that started streaming down his cheeks by the time he got to the end. And when he finally looked up at me, his expression held something that looked like wonder, mixed with grief, mixed with a fierce protectiveness that made me start crying all over again. "Emma," he said, and his voice cracked on my name. "Emma, she saw you. She really saw you." We stayed up until 3 in the morning at that kitchen table, talking through everything, examining each document and discussing what it meant and what we should do, and how our lives had just fundamentally changed in ways we were only beginning to understand. And David made pot after pot of coffee, and I pulled out the legal pad I used for lesson planning and started making lists, because that's what I did when I was overwhelmed. I made lists and tried to organize chaos into something manageable. The conversation kept circling back to the same questions, the same fears and possibilities and implications that felt too big to fully grasp. And the biggest fear that kept rising up in my chest and making it hard to breathe was the terrifying thought that maybe this money would change me in ways I didn't want to be changed. That maybe wealth did something to people that couldn't be avoided or controlled. "What if this changes me?" I asked David sometime around 2 in the morning, my voice small and scared in our quiet apartment. "What if I become like them?" David reached across the table and took both my hands in his grip warm and solid and certain, and he looked at me with those steady brown eyes that had seen me through 8 years of marriage and every difficulty we'd faced together, and said something that I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. "Money didn't make them cruel, Emma. They were already cruel. Money just gave them more ways to show it." We talked about who we should tell, working through the short list of people in our lives who mattered and who deserved to know what had happened, and we both agreed immediately that David's parents needed to be told, that Jim and Carol, who had welcomed me into their family with open arms from the first time David brought me home for dinner, and who had treated me with more genuine warmth and acceptance than my own mother had ever managed, deserved to know about my grandmother's gift and what it meant. But when we got to my family, the conversation became more complicated, more fraught with considerations about timing and strategy and self-protection. And I found myself hesitating, uncertain, torn between some lingering obligation to share this news with them and a growing certainty that they had forfeited the right to be included in the important moments of my life. "Not yet," I finally decided, and saying it out loud felt like both a relief and a rebellion. "I need to think." The next morning, I called in sick to school for the first time in 2 years, and leaving that voicemail for my principal felt strange and guilty, even though I had accumulated weeks of sick days I'd never used, even though I had a completely legitimate reason for needing a day to process what had happened. But I knew I couldn't face my classroom yet. Couldn't stand in front of 23 fourth graders and pretend to be normal and functional when my entire world had just shifted on its axis and I was still trying to find my balance. David and I got dressed in comfortable clothes and drove to the address Mr. Harrison had given me for the building I now owned, a modest 3-story brick structure in a neighborhood I walked through at least twice a week on my way to the literacy center where I volunteered. And as we pulled up to the curb and I stared at the building with its worn brick facade and its large ground floor windows and its fire escape zigzagging up the side, I realized I had passed this building hundreds of times and never known that my grandmother owned it. Never known she'd been quietly saving a literacy program while I'd been volunteering there. Never understood that she'd been paying attention to what I cared about and working behind the scenes to support it. The literacy center occupied the ground floor of the building I now owned, and as David and I stood on the sidewalk staring up at it that morning after I'd called in sick to school, I realized with a strange jolt of recognition that I had been inside this building dozens of times over the past 3 years, had volunteered here on Saturday mornings, helping adults learn to read, had sat at the donated tables in the main room, working with students who were 40, 50, 60 years old, and learning to decode words for the first time in their lives. And I had never known that my grandmother owned it had never understood that she'd been quietly supporting the same cause I cared about while I'd been volunteering my time. Never seen the invisible thread connecting us through this work we both valued. The director Maria was already there when we walked in, even though it was barely 8 in the morning, and she looked up from the coffee maker in the tiny staff kitchen with surprise and pleasure when she saw me, her warm brown face breaking into a smile before she registered my expression and David's presence and realized something significant was happening. "Emma," she said, and then after a pause, where she studied my face more carefully, "Coffee?" We followed her into her cramped office that was really just a converted storage closet, with a desk and 2 chairs and walls lined with filing cabinets full of student records and curriculum materials. And I sat down in the chair across from her desk and realized I hadn't actually decided what I was going to say or how much I was going to reveal. But Maria had this way of looking at you with such complete attention and warmth that I found myself telling her everything. The whole story spilling out of me in a rush that I couldn't quite control, about being excluded from the will reading and waiting in the side room, and Mr. Harrison calling me back, and the trust and my grandmother's letter and the building. This building, the one we were sitting in right now. Maria's eyes widened as I talked, and her hand came up to cover her mouth. And by the time I got to the part about the building deed being transferred to my name, she was crying openly, tears streaming down her face as she stared at me with an expression of wonder and grief mixed together. "Rose Blackwell was your grandmother?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "She was the one who saved us, Emma. When our old landlord was going to evict us 3 years ago because he could make more money turning this space into luxury condos, when we thought we were going to have to close down and turn away all our students, this mystery LLC bought the building and gave us a lease we could actually afford, and we've been trying to find out who owned it for years, trying to track down someone to thank them for literally saving our program." She reached across the desk and grabbed my hands, squeezing them hard. "We serve over 200 adults a year here, Emma. People who've been hiding the fact that they can't read for their entire lives, people who finally got up the courage to walk through our doors and ask for help. Your grandmother made that possible. She kept us alive." I felt something settle in my chest as Maria spoke. Some piece of understanding clicking into place about what my grandmother had been doing all these years. The quiet generosity she'd been practicing while her family fought over status symbols and property values and who got the bigger inheritance, and I realized this was what Rose had wanted me to see, the concrete impact of choosing to use money to support something that mattered, rather than just accumulating more wealth for its own sake. Maria wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath, and then said something that made my decision about the upstairs apartment suddenly very easy. "We've been hoping to expand our services for the past year," she said, "but the 2 residential units upstairs have been sitting empty, and our current lease doesn't include that space. And even if it did, we couldn't afford market rate for anything beyond what we're already renting. But if we could use those apartments, Emma, we could do so much more." Emma made her first decision as a property owner, right there in Maria's cramped office with David watching her and Maria waiting with an expression of careful hope that tried not to want too much or expect too much, because people in nonprofit work learned early not to count on miracles even when they desperately needed them. And Emma leaned forward in her chair and asked, "What if you could afford it, Maria? What would you do with the space upstairs?" Maria's face transformed instantly, her whole expression shifting from cautious hope to something that looked like joy mixed with disbelief. And Emma could tell immediately that Maria had thought about this extensively, had probably spent hours imagining what she could do if only she had the resources, if only someone gave her the chance. And Maria started talking faster and faster, her words tumbling over each other as she described her vision for the 2 empty apartments upstairs. "The larger unit could become a dedicated tutoring center for children," Maria explained, "a place where the kids of their adult students could get homework help and reading support in a safe and quiet environment, because so many of their students were parents who were learning to read alongside their children, or sometimes even after their children, trying to catch up so they could help with school assignments and read bedtime stories and not feel ashamed at parent-teacher conferences. The smaller apartment could be converted into a quiet study space and a small lending library stocked with high-interest adult reading materials. The kind of books that were engaging and relevant to adult lives, but written at accessible reading levels. Books about parenting and cooking and job skills and health. Books that treated adult learners with respect instead of handing them children's stories about talking animals and making them feel infantilized and embarrassed. "We have volunteers ready," Maria said, her voice intense with passion and planning. "People who've been asking for 2 years when they can start a children's program. And we have curriculum planned and supplies donated and everything ready. We just never had the space. We've only got the 3 rooms down here and they're always full with our adult classes." Emma felt David's hand squeeze her shoulder, and she looked up at him and saw in his expression that he knew what she was about to do and that he supported it completely. That this was exactly the kind of decision that money should enable. And she turned back to Maria and said with a certainty that surprised her with its steadiness, "Consider it yours, the whole upstairs. We'll draw up a new lease that includes both apartments at the same rate my grandmother was charging for the ground floor." Maria's eyes went wide and filled with tears, and she came around the desk so fast she almost knocked over her coffee mug and pulled Emma into a hug so tight Emma could barely breathe. And Maria was crying and saying, "Thank you, thank you, oh my God, thank you," over and over, while David grinned and Emma felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been uncertain and anxious crystallizing into purpose and direction and understanding about what her grandmother had really given her, which wasn't just money or property, but the ability to make this kind of difference, to say yes when someone needed help, to support work that mattered without worrying about her own security. Over the next week, Emma told almost no one about the inheritance, moving through her days with this enormous secret sitting in her chest like a stone that was somehow both heavy and weightless at the same time. And she returned to teaching on Wednesday, standing in front of her fourth graders and leading them through their reading groups and math lessons, while part of her brain was still processing everything that had changed. But her classroom felt like a welcome, normal space, a place where she knew exactly who she was and what she was supposed to be doing. She met with Mr. Harrison twice that week, once in his downtown office on Thursday afternoon and again on Saturday morning, and together they set up structures that felt right and responsible, establishing a foundation in her grandmother's name with $500,000 of the trust funds dedicated specifically to supporting literacy programs in underserved communities. And she paid off her and David's modest debts, writing checks for the $18,000 they still owed in student loans and the $6,000 on their credit card, and watching those balances drop to zero felt strange and anticlimactic, like something that should have been more dramatic or meaningful, but was really just numbers changing on a screen. The rest of the money sat in its accounts, accruing interest, while Emma thought and planned and tried to figure out who she wanted to be now that her grandmother had given her the freedom to choose. 3 weeks after the will reading, my mother Patricia called me for the first time in 8 months, and when I saw her name on my phone screen that Tuesday evening, while David and I were making dinner in our small kitchen, I felt my whole body tense with anticipation and dread, because Patricia never called just to chat or check in. There was always an agenda, always something she wanted or some criticism she needed to deliver. I answered on the fourth ring, and her voice came through with that particular tone of forced warmth that meant she was about to ask for something. "Emma, darling, we're having a family dinner this Sunday at my house, just something casual to bring everyone together, and your grandmother would have wanted us all to stay close during this difficult time." The manipulation was so transparent, I almost laughed out loud. The invocation of Grandma Rose's wishes by the same woman who had systematically excluded me from family events for years, who had made it nearly impossible for me to visit Rose during her final years, who had barely spoken to me at the funeral just a month ago, and I felt a surge of something that might have been anger, or might have been just exhausted resignation, as I said in my most polite voice, "Thank you for the invitation, Mom, but David and I have plans this Sunday." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that felt heavy and dangerous. And when Patricia spoke again, her voice had dropped all pretense of warmth and gone cold and sharp, the way it always did when she didn't get what she wanted. Emma, I know you're hurt that you didn't get anything from Mother's will, but you're still family, and you could at least pretend to care about maintaining relationships with your brother and sister. The words hit exactly where she'd aimed them, right at that tender place where I'd spent 32 years hoping for acceptance and belonging. But something had shifted in me since I'd sat in Mr. Harrison's library and read my grandmother's letter, since I'd learned that Rose had seen me and valued me and chosen me, and I took a slow breath and said with more steadiness than I'd ever managed before with my mother, I did get something from Grandma, Mom. I got her letters over the years, her time, her attention when she could give it. That was enough. I hung up before Patricia could respond, my hands shaking slightly as I set the phone down on the kitchen counter, and David came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist and squeezed me tight, and I could feel in that embrace that he was proud of me for setting that boundary, for not letting her manipulate me into feeling guilty or lesser or wrong. But Sunday morning at 9 a.m., there was a sharp knock on our apartment door. And when I opened it, still in my sweatpants with my coffee mug in hand, I found Trevor standing in our hallway, looking irritated and impatient. And before I could say anything, he pushed past me into our small living room and looked around with an expression of barely concealed disdain at our second-hand furniture and our modest television, and our walls covered with student artwork and photographs in cheap frames. We need to talk about Grandma's estate, Trevor said without preamble. Without hello, or how are you, or any pretense of this being a social visit, and I felt my guard go up instantly, felt that new protective instinct kick in as I closed the door and turned to face him. Okay, I said carefully, staying near the door, not moving further into the room. And Trevor sprawled on our old couch that David and I had bought used off Craigslist 5 years ago, making himself comfortable in our space without being invited, his expensive wool coat draped across the cushions and his designer shoes on our worn rug. Mom thinks there might be some assets that weren't properly accounted for in Grandma's estate, he said, his tone casual, but his eyes watching me carefully. Some LLC property purchases, some investment accounts that weren't included in the public will, financial records that show discrepancies. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I kept my face neutral and took a sip of my coffee to give myself a moment to think. And I asked in what I hoped was a mildly curious voice, what kind of discrepancies? Trevor waved his hand dismissively in that gesture I'd seen 1,000 times before, the one that said whatever he was about to say was both obvious and beneath him to have to explain. And he said in a tone of fake casualness, some LLC property purchases, some investment accounts that weren't in the will, probably nothing significant, but Mom's lawyer wants to do a full audit of Grandma's estate to make sure everything was properly disclosed and distributed. He leaned forward slightly on my couch, his expensive watch catching the light from our window. And his expression shifted into something that was supposed to look like concern, but came across as calculating and predatory, and he added, I know you didn't get anything in the will, Emma, and that must hurt. But if something additional turns up during the audit, something Grandma maybe forgot to include, or that got overlooked somehow, then it should be divided fairly among all the grandchildren, right? That's only fair. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure Trevor could see it through my thin t-shirt, but I kept my face as neutral as possible and took a slow sip of my coffee to buy myself a moment to think. Because I could see the play now with perfect clarity, could see exactly what was happening and why Trevor had shown up at my apartment on a Sunday morning without calling first or asking if this was a good time. They had found hints of the trust somehow, had probably hired a forensic accountant to go through Rose's financial records, looking for assets they felt entitled to, and they'd discovered references to the LLC that owned my building, or traces of the investment accounts that held the $3.2 million, and now they were on a fishing expedition, trying to figure out what existed and where it was and whether they could claim some portion of it, And Trevor was here specifically to gauge my reaction, to see if I knew anything, to try to manipulate me into either revealing what I knew or agreeing in advance that any found assets should be shared equally. If Grandma wanted something divided a certain way, I'm sure her will and her estate planning reflected exactly what she intended, I said carefully, keeping my voice even and mild, not defensive, not aggressive, just stating what seemed like an obvious fact. Trevor's expression hardened immediately, his fake concern dropping away to reveal the irritation and contempt that was always just beneath the surface when he looked at me. And he sat up straighter on my couch and said with an edge of anger in his voice, "See? This is exactly typical of you, Emma. You always act so high and mighty, like you're morally superior to the rest of us, because you're a teacher and you drive a shit car and you live in this tiny apartment and pretend you're happy with nothing. You act like you're above caring about money. Like you're too pure and good to want nice things. But I guarantee if money suddenly showed up, if some hidden account surfaced with your name on it, you'd grab it just as fast as anyone else. Probably faster since you've spent your whole life pretending you don't care about wealth while secretly resenting the rest of us for having it." The mask had fully dropped now, and I was seeing the real Trevor, the one who had always looked at me with a mixture of disdain and confusion, because I'd made choices he couldn't understand and built a life that didn't match his definition of success or value. And something in his words, in the naked contempt in his voice, and the assumption that I was just like him underneath it all, that I was only pretending to have different values and priorities, made something snap into place inside me, made me realize that I was done protecting his feelings, or managing his perception, or trying to prove anything to someone who had already decided who I was and would never see me any differently. I looked at my brother sprawled on my couch in his $1,000 coat, judging my life and my choices and making assumptions about who I was based on nothing but his own narrow understanding of the world. And I felt something click into place inside me, a clarity I'd never quite achieved before in all my years of trying to explain myself or defend my choices or prove my worth to people who had already decided I had none. "Trevor," I said quietly, setting my coffee mug down on the side table with deliberate care, "I need you to leave now." He blinked at me, clearly surprised because I'd never asked him to leave before, had never set that kind of boundary or asserted that kind of control over my own space, and he let out a short laugh that sounded more confused than amused. "What? We're not done talking about this, Emma. This is important. This is about family assets and making sure everything is handled properly." I walked to the door and opened it, standing there with my hand on the knob, and I looked at him with a calmness that felt new and strange, and somehow deeply right. "We are done talking about it. Grandma's estate was handled exactly the way she wanted it handled, by lawyers she hired and paid very well to execute her wishes precisely. If you and Mom want to waste money on an audit, that's your choice, but I'm not going to be part of whatever fishing expedition this is." Trevor stood up slowly, his face darkening with anger, and he took a step toward me with that intimidating physical presence he'd always used to make me feel small and uncertain. "You know something," he said, his voice dropping low and accusatory. "You're hiding something. What did that lawyer say to you? Why did he keep you there after we left?" I felt my heart hammering, but I kept my voice steady and met his eyes without flinching. He expressed his condolences and went over some personal items Grandma left me. Some photographs, some jewelry, nothing that concerns you or Mom or Madison. It wasn't technically a lie, just an incomplete truth. And I watched Trevor's face as he tried to decide whether to believe me or push harder. "If money shows up that wasn't in the will, Emma, we will find out. And there will be legal consequences if you try to hide assets that should be split among all the grandchildren." The threat was explicit now. No more fake concern or pretend family unity, just naked entitlement and the assumption that anything Rose had owned should belong to them by right. "I'm sure Grandma's lawyers followed all applicable laws, Trevor. Now please leave. David and I have plans this morning." Trevor stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether to escalate or retreat, and finally, he grabbed his coat from the couch and walked toward the door, stopping right in front of me so close I could smell his expensive cologne. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "Family is supposed to stick together, and you've always been on the outside because you choose to be. Because you think you're too good for us." He left without waiting for a response, brushing past me into the hallway, and I closed the door behind him and locked it and stood there with my back against the wood, feeling my hands shake with delayed adrenaline, and something that might have been fear or might have been exhilaration at having finally stood my ground. David came out of the bedroom then, having heard Trevor's raised voice, and he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest and an expression on his face I'd never quite seen before, protective and quietly furious, and he said in a calm voice that somehow carried more weight than any shouting could, "Trevor, Emma asked you to leave 10 minutes ago and you're still here, uninvited, in our home, insulting her." Trevor glanced at David dismissively, the way he'd always looked at my husband since the day they met, as if David's non-profit salary and lack of family connections made him barely worth acknowledging, and he said with a sneer that didn't quite hide his contempt, "This is family business, David. It doesn't concern you." But David didn't move from the doorway, and he didn't raise his voice, and he said with perfect clarity, "Emma is my family. You're just someone who shares some DNA with her and has spent 32 years making her feel like that's not enough. Now you need to leave before I call the building manager and have you removed for trespassing." I watched my brother's face cycle through surprise and anger and calculation, saw him weigh whether pushing this confrontation further would serve his purposes or damage them. And finally he stood up from the couch with exaggerated slowness, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the door where David stood blocking his path. For a moment, I thought Trevor might actually try to physically intimidate David, might use his extra 3 inches of height and his gym-sculpted build to make some kind of point. But David just stood there absolutely still, and somehow that stillness contained more strength than any aggressive posturing could have. And Trevor stepped around him and headed for the door, where I still stood with my hand on the knob. He paused right at the threshold, close enough that I could see the anger in his eyes and the set of his jaw, and he said quietly enough that David probably couldn't hear from across the room, "You know what I think? I think Grandma did leave you something you're hiding. And when Mom's lawyers find it, and they will find it because they're very good at what they do, you're going to look like a thief and a liar to the whole family." The threat was naked now, stripped of any pretense of concern or family unity, just pure entitlement and the assumption that anything Rose had owned should by rights belong to them. And I looked at my brother and felt something I'd never quite felt before when facing him, a complete absence of the fear and self-doubt that had always made me back down or apologize or try to explain myself. I met his eyes directly, and I said in a voice that didn't shake at all, "Get out of my home, Trevor, and don't come back unless you're invited, which I can promise you won't be happening anytime soon." He stared at me for another few seconds, clearly trying to decide if there was any more advantage to be gained from this confrontation, and then he left without another word, his footsteps heavy and angry in the hallway outside. I closed the door and locked it and stood there for a moment with my forehead pressed against the cool wood, feeling the adrenaline drain out of my system and leave behind something that felt like exhaustion, mixed with a strange kind of exhilaration, because I had never in my entire life stood up to Trevor like that, had never set a boundary so clearly or enforced it so definitively, and some part of me was waiting for the guilt to crash over me the way it always did when I disappointed my family, or failed to meet their expectations, or refused to play along with whatever dynamic they'd established. But the guilt didn't come, or at least not the way I expected it to, and instead, I felt David's hand on my shoulder, gentle and grounding, and he turned me around and pulled me into a hug that I melted into, my face pressed against his chest, his heartbeat steady and reassuring under my ear. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, and I realized I was shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of having defended myself, of having refused to explain or justify or apologize for existing in a way my family found inconvenient. We stood there in the entryway for a long time, David just holding me while I processed what had happened. And finally, I pulled back and looked up at him and said, "They're going to keep pushing." Trevor basically admitted they're looking for the trust, and when they find proof it exists, they're going to demand I share it, or claim Grandma wasn't in her right mind when she created it, or find some legal angle to challenge it. David nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful, and he said, "Maybe it's time to talk to Mr. Harrison about what our options are, what kind of legal protections are already in place, because your grandmother was obviously smart enough to anticipate this possibility." The thought hadn't occurred to me that Rose might have planned for my family's reaction, might have built in safeguards knowing exactly how Trevor and Patricia and Madison would respond once they realized they hadn't gotten everything they felt entitled to. And I felt a fresh wave of grief mixed with gratitude that even in death, even through legal documents and trust structures, my grandmother was still trying to protect me from the family that had spent 3 decades making me feel less than. We spent the rest of Sunday in the apartment, not talking much, just being together in the quiet space we'd built for ourselves, and I found myself thinking about Grandma Rose and the choices she'd made, the lifetime of compromises and silences and public performances that had allowed her to maintain family peace while secretly nurturing the relationship with me that no one else knew about. I thought about the photographs in the locked box, the ones of her teaching herself to read at that library table, and I understood in a way I hadn't quite grasped before that Rose had seen herself in me, had recognized something fundamental about the experience of being underestimated and dismissed, and having to prove your worth to people who had already decided you had none. And she'd tried in the only way she knew how to give me what she'd never had, which was choices and freedom and the security to live life on my own terms without having to beg for scraps of approval from people who would never freely give it.